Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director, and I'd like to welcome you to the Architecture League's revised First Friday series, now on Thursdays and renamed FF Distance Edition. During this season of virtual programming, we're taking the opportunity to visit studios well outside of New York City and are focusing on practices to expand disciplinary boundaries by taking on multiple roles, coupling architecture with initiatives including design advocacy, fabrication research, and community engagement. Like First Fridays, this series focuses on design studios with an emphasis on directly experiencing not just what a practice is producing, but also where and how they work. Ideally, and this is up to all of you, these sessions also provide the opportunity to meet and converse with firm principals and project teams through an open Q&A session following the more formal presentation and discussion. Tonight, we're visiting the studio and experimental structures that you can see in the background of Rael and Fratello and their 3D printing make tank, Emerging Objects. Although their home base is in Oakland, Ron and Virginia, who are truly living the concept of distance, are speaking tonight from their current residence and studio in Antonito, Colorado, where they'll show you their ongoing project, the full-scale 3D printed mud frontiers Casa Covida. And their current location also grounds, quite literally, their work focusing on the historic and current US-Mexico borderlands. Their concept of architecture and practice is wide-ranging and defies easy definition, as suggested on their website. Following is just a partial list of how they describe themselves. We are a studio that disrupts the conventions of architecture by tackling topics not typically of interest to architects. We start galleries in the middle of nowhere. We talk to homeless people. We stack straw bales. We play in the mud. We start corporations. We imagine a better border. We question green. We love fluorescence and brown. We write. We educate. We learn. We believe that when there is architecture, there should also be food. We believe salt has a place in architecture. We are obsessed by materials. We try to proceed and be bold. Following Ron and Virginia's presentation, Cristina De Leon, the Associate Curator of Latino Design at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, will follow up with some questions for Ron and Virginia. And then the discussion will be open to all attendees. And you can either speak up, if you raise your hand, you can speak directly, or you can pose questions in the chat section. So we'll unmute at that point. Anyway, let's now go to Colorado.
All right, thank you. And I'm Ronald Rael, and I'm here with Virginia San Fratello. Do you want to say hi, Virginia?
I'm Virginia San Fratello. Hello.
Hi, we're both in different locations, but not too far away from each other, about, I don't know, 500 yards away from each other. So welcome everyone to La Florida, Colorado. This is a village that my family's lived in for 7 generations. And this is behind me, Casa Covida. It's a house for cohabitation that we built now during the time of COVID, when we relocated here to my ancestral village to experiment with 3D printing and 3D printing using Adobe, which many of the houses here in this county are made out of. And so I thought that I would first give you a little tour before the sun goes down of Casa Covida. And then I'll contextualize this work a little bit relative to the borders. And then we'll go over to Virginia, and she'll talk about some of the origins of this and some of the experimentations with materials. So come on along. I'll show you my laptop stand really quickly. So just to give you a sense of the building, these are 3 different rooms, and I'll talk about the program, but over to the left, you'll see that we're experimenting with beginning to program these structures, and we've constructed many of them on this property. You might see some over there behind the truck a little bit. Those are some of our earlier experiments. There's one we call the hearth that's out in the field out there. And here we're beginning to think about, how do we 3D print furniture? How can we 3D print program? How can we make spaces for gathering, and thinking about how this technology might be used not only to create prototypes and experiments, but maybe in the future reintroduce Adobe as a viable material in contemporary architecture and construction. So let's go inside. The first room inside is a space for gathering. And you can see that it is space with seating. And so two people can sit and hang out and talk. And we have a fireplace where we can actually cook. You see, we have some of the pots that Virginia will show and talk about later that are also made of local clay. I'm gonna just put a little bit of wood on the fire. What we burn here, we also use the same wood to make the pottery, is Western juniper, which grows locally. And it's beautiful because it's aromatic and smells really wonderful, but also has this amazing purple color. I don't know if you can see that so well on the camera. One thing about this space is that it has these amazing oculi up into the sky. And so while we were considering a roof for this building, we're also really taken by the fact that we can see the sky and the stars and the clouds moving overhead. This room here is a space for bathing. You can see we don't have the tub filled with water right now, but it's also a place where you can see the sky while you're taking a bath. The exterior rocks are made out of tumbled river stone, and the interior rocks actually glow. And over here is the wonderful room for two people to sleep. And I'm moving my laptop up and down because I don't know how wide angle the lens is, but it's a room that has space for two people, and the surface is made out of cheap lamb pelts. And if we zoom in a little bit, we're working with some friends, indigenous weavers, who are wove these beautiful textiles for us, these beautiful pillows. This one actually has the plan of Casa Covida on it. So you see the hearth space, the bathing space, and the sleeping space. And that is this beautiful view out into the field through this window. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about this place that we're coming from right now and give you a little sense of what we're up to out here. We'll do that by sharing my screen. So we're in a pretty special place in Colorado. It's at 8,000 feet above sea level, and it's where we are beginning to reconceptualize what the borderlands is, and kind of returning to ways of thinking about architecture that grows from this landscape. We are in the highest alpine valley in the world, called Valle De San Luis, or San Luis Valley. And it defines borders in many different ways. One is it's surrounded by 13,000 and 14,000 foot peaks, and it straddles the border between the states of Colorado and New Mexico. And until 1848, this was the northernmost frontier of what was then Mexico. And so the relationship that we have to the United States historically was similar to what you might think of the border cities today and their relationship to the United States along that border. It's also the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, which of course today defines the contemporary border between the United States and Mexico, but it was the river itself that fed and was the lifeblood of people who have lived here for thousands of years. The Pueblo, the Kiowa, the Ute, the Comanche, the Jicarilla Apache, and also a route for colonialization and settlement to the north. And so in this landscape, the memory and history of this being the borderland still continues. And these are some of the earliest kinds of structures that were built here when Colorado was settled, especially after the Mexican-American War, when it was New Mexico and then Colorado Territory before it became a state. And many of these buildings still exist. And we are actively working to preserve many of these buildings. I think we are currently working on 11 different adobe houses in the surrounding like 8 or 9 miles from where I'm standing right now, including my own house, our own house, which is just down the road. And this was my great-grandfather's sister's family house. And it was one of these houses, just like you saw previously, a flat roof adobe house. My father put on this roof in the 60s, but we use this village and this ranch as a way to teach traditional construction methods, adobe construction, earth and plaster, but also traditional and indigenous foodways. And so the construction of hornos, the making of traditional and indigenous foods. And so in addition to that, we're, let's say, immigrating technologies into this landscape and thinking about how in the borderlands we can create, the borderlands is really kind of a hybrid culture where we move between speaking different languages, having foods that are very different, coming together to make new kinds of fusions, music, belief systems. And so we're beginning to think about how technology and tradition come together to make new forms of architecture. And one of those ways is to think about how we can make and think about the traditional building systems that are here, adobe, and take that ground from the mud and 3D print with earth. We began some of this research on the contemporary border where we worked with ceramic artists, ceramic professors from UTEP in El Paso, geology professors from UTEP in El Paso, and together with 25 artists from both Juarez and El Paso, we gathered local clays and studied them and thought about this several thousand-year-old tradition of ceramics at the border. And we developed this software that Virginia is going to talk about a little bit later, where the ceramic artist could basically 3D print ceramic vessels. And as part of this exhibition, we asked them to print a couple of vessels, and we hope we get like 50 vessels out of this experimental process. But they were so excited, they produced over 270 of these beautiful ceramic objects from clays from both Juarez and El Paso, and sometimes mixed together in beautiful ways. But part of the vision of these experiments in pottery were destined to think about how we could 3D print at a much larger scale using local clays and soils. And so we began to embark about 3 years ago on an experimental process, because this was kind of the goal. And it's funny now for me to stand next to these and see this image, which is about 5 years old, because this was the kind of idea, when was this possible? And so we partnered with a company that manufactures ceramic printers called 3D Potter. And we sent them this schematic design to say, well, could we make a printer that prints larger than the printer itself? And this is what we arrived at, a printer that could print lots of small objects at once, which was exciting, but of course, print one single large object. And think about how we could scale that further and further. We had to think about how do we scale the movement of material as well, like pumping massive amounts of dirt. So this kind of a manual 3D printer where we're experimenting with mud, but eventually we got better and better at this process. And 2 years ago, we took this research back to the border on a mesa in El Paso overlooking Juarez and embarked on this project we call Mud Frontiers. MUD is also an acronym of mobility and ubiquity and democracy, because we like the idea that we can make a portable printer that you could plop down in any remote environment and use a very ubiquitous material of earth, but also the robot itself is very inexpensive. And so possibly anybody could have it. And that brings in this kind of democracy of reintroducing technology and traditional technology and contemporary technology together. And so for the first time in history, at the borderlands, we started 3D printing with mud. And so some of the projects that are just on the property here are conceptualized around light, the lightness of the material versus a massive adobe structure, and lightness of thinking about these as beacons in the night using LED lights to illuminate them. Also thinking about this is conceptualized as a lookout, but it was really an experiment in how we print circulation. How do you print stairs, for example, something to walk on. We also, with our continued interest in pottery, began to think about how we can use one as a kiln, and working with some friends from the traditions of Taos Pueblo, harvested local clays and fired pottery. And you may have seen some of those in the Casa Covida a little while ago, that are functional pottery that's made out of clays just harvested from the ground. And of course, this is where we started to experiment with 3D printing furniture and imagining program, and this one we call the hearth, a place for gathering together. And so just a quick walkthrough, since I couldn't walk you through in the day, I took this video just to show you some of our workflow. Here's where we sift dirt and mix it with straw. The dirt's just harvested from the field 50 yards away. Some of our earliest structures, the one on the right was the first one, the second one. The taller one you see, we constructed this summer, and all of them are a particular size you see, but that was an experiment in going higher, which we hadn't done before. We actually made a platform on which we could print higher. So that's called the Oculus. And we were also thinking about how we could begin to print a dome, and we were pretty conservative there and thinking about how we could trebiate the structure. It happens to have a installation by Felix Gonzalez Torres now, which is a pile of fortune cookies, really a project about hope, which is really urgent and timely for now. Some of our recent experiments. So this is the construction of Casa Covida just a couple of months ago, where we made this rail, this kind of fourth axis that we can move the printer along, so that we're no longer waiting for the mud to dry before we print it again, but we could print and then move the robot itself, and then print again and move the robot and move quite rapidly through by constructing a sequence of spaces. So that little thin thing that you see in the middle, that's the robot. That's what's making these things. And all we're doing is filling it with dirt that's pumped through this hose. The big tractor in the back, all its job is doing is holding the hose up in the air. Oops. So you can see me, driving the robot with my iPhone. I don't know if I'm driving or checking Instagram, and that's the platform that the robot sits on, so we could print higher. There's where we're getting a little bit higher. We're experimenting with just lintels and inserting them into the structure, so we can make openings like windows and doors. Here's an example of one of the final layers going on really quickly, with the cows in the background, a couple of friends coming to see it. And that's Casa Covida. Some of the interiors, when we were just done printing, thinking about how you make a door and a window. That window defines a very particular tree that I like in the field. There's the cows on the ranch. The view of the sky and the clouds. And some of our early experiments thinking about how we might furnish the interiors, and the first bathing in Casa Covida. And one final view from just a week ago. A week ago? Yeah, this was a week ago. It seems really crazy because it's so nice and sunny and warm right now, but just a week ago we had this crazy snowfall of about, close to a foot. So it's a work in progress. It's an experiment. And I'm really happy that I get to share it with everyone tonight. And so we're gonna zoom over to Virginia, who's not too far away. And I'm just gonna go hang out and listen in the Casa Covida. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm here in our workshop, which is about a half a mile away from the Casa Covida. This is a place where we have been doing some small scale 3D printing parallel to the large printing of the Casa Covida. One of the things that we've been doing is sourcing local micaceous clay. This is a clay from northern New Mexico. It's a clay that's been used for thousands of years by the Taos Pueblo and the Picoris Pueblo to make traditional pottery. And what's really special about the clay is that it has mica in it. And this mineral allows the finished clay pot to absorb a thermal shock. So you can use this 3D printed clay or traditional clay pots on a fire or on the stove or in an oven and cook with them. So one of the things that we've been experimenting with is making 3D printed ceramics. We're interested in making really functional ceramics. So for example, this is a micaceous clay carafe. This has been fired in an electric kiln. When the clay comes out of the ground, it's kind of this, I don't know if I want to get dirt on my computer, but maybe you can see this nice brown color and you can see the little flecks of mica in it. And if you look closely, you can see the sparkle in the object itself. So we've been making these pieces, including cookware that you can have on your stovetop. So for example, this is another piece that's been 3D printed out of the micaceous clay. This is for a bread loaf pan. This one is black because we fired it in the 3D printed kiln, which Ron showed you earlier. So it's fired in a pit and it's smothered, so there's no oxygen in there, and that turns the clay completely black. So I'll put it a little bit closer to the camera so you can maybe see some of the sparkle here as well. And I'll just turn my screen around and show you some of the other objects that we're making. So here, for example, is a bean pot, and the form of this is based on the traditional Taos bean pot. So, it has a knob on top and you could cook inside it. This is unfired, so I'm not going to move it around too much. It's still soft. This is another one. This is a soup tureen, and over there we have a small casserole dish as well. And of course, we want to utilize these pieces as functional ceramics, but we also imagine them as study models. And as Ron mentioned, there were those tall frustrum or dome-shaped experimental 3D prints that we did a couple of years ago, and we finally started to realize that this summer in the Casa Covida. And I'm hopeful that one day we'll have the opportunity to 3D print buildings and maybe that take on some of these forms and these textures that you see here. So they serve two purposes for us. I'd also like to show you some of the software that we use to make these and how it works. So let me just share my screen with you. So this is the software called Potterware, which runs in the cloud. if you want to play around with it, you can go to our website, Emerging Objects, and play around with the software yourself. This is the design for the bean pot, which I was just showing you, and which I was just printing, but it stopped. So maybe in a few minutes, Ron can take over, or while we're talking, I'll get it started again so I can show you how the printer prints. But I'll just demonstrate a little bit of the capabilities of the printer itself. You can change the size of an object. For example, over here, you could change the shape or the profile by manipulating these sliders. And of course, the blur here just means that it's thinking, like the wheel is spinning, for example, right? So now you can see I've taken that relatively complex form and made it completely different shape. And what's nice about this, I think, is we're just using the G code, which is the language that speaks to the printer itself. And we're taking that line of clay for a walk. So you can see down here at the bottom, the clay is just going in continuous circles and spiraling up until we get to a point where we've added these waves or loops. And these loops, of course, are decorative and they're beautiful, but they also give it structure and make these forms a little bit stronger. And in the software, you can also play around with the horizontal effects or the waves or the loops themselves. For example, right now there are 70 loops, and I could decrease that number to be 20 and have a completely different design just by changing that one really small parameter. And we can also change the different types of loops, for example. So right now we're using a sawtooth, but we could change it to be square. And I think for us, one of the powerful things about this software is that it allows someone who doesn't have any 3D modeling experience or 3D printing experience to design something that can be 3D printed and print it within just a matter of a few hours. So we're trying to use this software as an opportunity to kind of lower the bar to make this technology more accessible to more people. So the students at UTEP that Ron talked about earlier, literally within one day, these students who had never printed anything or modeled anything before in their life were up and running and making some incredibly beautiful objects. So I think I'll hand it off maybe to Ron or Christina for a few minutes, and I'll try to get the printer started, and maybe we can come back and have a look at that.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Virginia. This is super exciting. And Ron, I love how you were able to give us a bit of a tour with Casa Covida. It's interesting because, you know, we started with this massive structure, which is large and architectural, and it's all inspired by these small, intimate ceramic pieces. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the transition from small ceramic wares to large architecture within these last few years that you have been printing and working on Mud Frontiers. Just to give the audience a little bit of a background, I had invited Ron to Cooper Hewitt for a talk about maybe almost 4 years ago. And he was doing a workshop printing. And in the middle of printing a small piece, he said, and next summer, we're gonna 3D print a house. And I thought to myself, what? What are you talking about? But I found it so intriguing and exciting. And I said, well, what if Cooper Hewitt goes and we just follow you and we record this process of you 3D printing with Adobe on your ancestral land? And so that's what we did. And we've been following Ron and Virginia for the past 2 years as they work on this project. And it's been really fascinating for me as a curator, as someone who works within a museum environment, to really be out on the field and seeing how Ron and Virginia have been troubleshooting, working through all of the challenges that they face, not just with this new technology, but also printing outside, being outside of the studio, which is where you have been printing a lot of your ceramics and using this type of technology. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about these challenges and how you've worked through them, and the transitions you've made from your print studies, your test prints, to this like incredible 3-room structure that you're sitting in right now, so cozy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try to give a little bit of background to this. This has been a very long journey, in fact, and it's something that in 2008, I completed a book called Earth Architecture, and I wondered what the future of Earth architecture was. And I wrote that maybe it's 3D printing. And we thought, yeah, we want to do that. And so, if I zoom back to 2009 or 10, we had printed some really small objects out of clay, just thinking and imagining about how we might be able to 3D print clay at larger scales in the future. And it took a really long time. And it was with our collaborations with a manufacturer that we finally were able to make this big leap. And that relationship emerged because I had been following this person who was making ceramic printers for some time. And I think I bought one of his first printers that he ever made. And we started experimenting with these different ways of depositing clay. So making these loops and making these forms that we didn't know would have such an impact in the ceramics world. And we weren't trained ceramicists. But we learned that these loops have a really important function at a larger scale, which is, as probably most of you are aware, since maybe the Zoom room is filled with architects, that a straight line of material is less strong than a curved line. And that applies to masonry as well. It applies to earth in this case. So by making these curved lines in the pottery, as Virginia mentioned, gives it structural strength. At the larger scale, it gives it incredible strength. So some of those structures that I showed today were, in some cases, 3 inches thick, but incredibly strong because of the corrugation of the material. And so there's been a lot of development with our team. It's not just Virginia and I, but it's a whole group of former Berkeley students who help us, and our partnerships with industry, and my rare opportunity to have land in the middle of nowhere to be able to do this. And so, that it's been a really interesting journey, and we don't know where it will go. We're optimistic about it, but you, Christine, have witnessed some of the trials and tribulations of just like, we spent a month trying to print the first thing and pumping mud, and it was really crazy. But now we've arrived at a place where we really have a certain degree of confidence about being able to make structures this large. And so I'm very excited to think about what the next step in scaling up might be. Probably can't see.
One of the things that I thought was very interesting when I was out there with you all is, while you are using a 3D printer robot and you have computers, there is a certain amount of feedback, that you have, there's a lot of back and forth. You're obviously sifting through the mud just to get it to a consistency that that is printable. So while I think, a lot of the videos that you showed, it looks so smooth, but there's a lot of, craft and handwork that goes into it as well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think that many people might think, well, the 3D printer is taking over craft. And you know, you lose the sense of the hand and you're no longer engaged with the material. But both at the scale of building the building and scale of pottery, there's a lot of iteration. There's a lot of touching the material. There's a lot of testing, thinking about the environment that you're in. Is it dry? Is it windy? Is it humid? Thinking about how you deposit the material. It's just, I think, of course, the ceramicist uses many tools, from the wheel to the various hand tools that one uses to shape the clay. And we do too, but I think it's just a different kind of tool that has different results. And at the larger scale, we're doing everything from digging and sifting and mixing and sticking our hands in the mud and saying, does this have enough sand? Does it have too much clay? Is the pump going to accept this material? Do we need to add more water? What's the weather like today? How many layers can we put down because of the wind? And so the robot didn't disconnect us from the world. It actually connected us much more with the world in some ways, because we're also building it, we're also designing it and thinking about it in the digital realm and through drawings, but we're also thinking about it relative to the larger context. And so that context is not only the historical context, but it's you know, if you watch some of the earlier videos, we're collecting cow pies and surrounding the construction site and burning them because it's really wet here at a certain time of the year, and we're getting rid of the mosquitoes doing that, and we're just really in tune with everything around us while we're making this. You know, is the robot going to get rained on? Do we have to cover it? So we just have this heightened awareness of everything, I think, and that's yeah.
And I'll just chime in now, since we're up and printing, and I'll try to give you a close-up view of that. Is that good? Can you see it?
Great.
So I think another door that working with the robotics has opened is that, you know, it's allowed us to create things that we otherwise never would have been able to. You know, I'm not a potter or a ceramicist, and I never imagined a year or two ago that I would be able to make something with this kind of intricacy. And I think working with the robot, and that's how I think about it, working cobotically has allowed us to do things that we would otherwise never be able to do, which is exciting. And back to the point of that Ron was making about working iteratively and learning about the materials, you know, we spend a lot of time going back and forth. We design something in the potterware and we print it, and then we might realize, oh, the loops are too close together or they're too long. And so we go back and forth, of course, just like you do with any architectural project, until we finally arrive at a design that we think works, but then we have to recalibrate it based on the material itself. Like, I just realized, oh, this clay is a little hard because it's been freezing every night here for the last 2 weeks. So I have to increase the speed and the extrusion rate, or the force of the printer to push the clay through, because it's a little bit harder than it was maybe a month ago. And also, what else did I want to say? Yeah. So I think it's a learning process. You know, the climate, of course, whether it's cold or hot or dry, all of these things affect what we're making at all these different scales. So every day there's a new challenge.
I love this this relationship you have with the soil in this, you know, specific region, and this idea that you're not only printing pots, but you're also printing architecture, and, you know, this relationship with the land that I think is really interesting and dynamic. But what I really love and what I was able to see, I felt so lucky, you know, my last night in Antonito, you printed, well, you had printed a few pots and then you fired them in the pit, in the pit fire, in this sort of 3D printed structure that you had made. And so I wonder if you have a bit of a preference when it comes to the pit firing versus the kiln, and the kinds of effects you get, and the differences between those two processes.
I think personally, if we could pit fire everything, that would be amazing. You know, if we could pit fire it under the full moon, that would be even more amazing, right? Because it's so special to be there and to understand that, you know, this is the material that you've dug yourself from the ground, and you're literally putting it back into this ground, right, to make it something that is functional and usable, because you're making it hard again by putting it back where it came from. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. I think there's also some different qualities that in the finish that we're able to achieve in the pit fire, like the coloration. So we can control whether it's orange or black, or I like to say it has some kind of like a calico finish, or maybe a gradient or an ombre, and you can start to control that a little bit by the extent to which you smother the pieces. And so there's a kind of beauty there, again, another craft that comes into play, I think, when you're pit firing. And there are probably experts who are firing in kilns that know much more than I do. And they're able to get some of these effects in an electric or a gas kiln as well. But I think firing it in the pit is kind of a beautiful part of the process.
I agree. So I just want to make sure that we have enough time for the audience to ask a few questions. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if someone would like to speak up and raise their hand, I think Martin Finio, you have your hand up if you want to unmute yourself.
I'm here, and I'll even turn my camera on. Hello, Ron and Virginia.
Hi.
I have to say that after 8 months sitting at my kitchen table in Tribeca, this is probably the most fun I've had in a very long time. It's very, very nice to be out in the fire in Colorado in a mud casa. And I don't even know if I have a question. I have thousands of questions. But mostly it's just wonderful. What you're doing is wonderful. And I think that there's a kind of, I look at you guys right now as kind of critics of architecture, but through making architecture. You're actually finding a way to critique what we do, but through the making of it rather than through the talking about it. And I find that to be a wonderful thing. This whole idea of sort of critique through making. And this also, you know, everything that we make is of the earth, right? Architecture, all the materials of architecture are of the earth. Your glasses are of the earth. Our clothing is of the earth. My kitchen counter and my cabinets are of the earth. So we take the earth, we reformat it, and we put it back in the earth. But the way that you guys are skipping so many of those steps and coming back to this very, very fundamental way of taking the earth and basically saying this is good enough and putting it back, which is just, it's beautiful. But what also I find so amazing about it is this idea of on the one hand, operating with the most primitive of ingredients, but doing it with the most, you know, sort of high-tech means. So you're at these two sort of polar ends of the ways of making. And so I wonder, I guess if Anne told me I had to ask a question, so I'm trying I'm trying to turn this all into a question. So my real question is, where do I buy a Micaceous Clay bread loaf pan? That's my real question. But I will also ask, do you guys see a kind of, is there a way, like, do you care about the middle? Do you care about the middle ground between these two realms of 3D printing and mud? And that this is not a judgmental question at all. It's more, I want the answer to be no, actually. But like, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, basically, that casa that Ron is in right now is mud. And when I go make architecture, maybe there's some mud in it, but then I've got the freaking polystyrene, and I've got there's layers. There's a kind of assembly. There's parts. It's an assemblage. And you found a way to make something that does away with all of those layers. But it is what it is, and I'm sure, Ron, you're probably a bit cold right now, and when it rains, you're going to get wet.
My jacket.
But maybe that's okay. Like, I just want to understand where you reside in that realm of these two extremes that you're working in, and everything that's in between.
Yeah, Virginia and I might have very different answers. Maybe a question back to you eventually might be, well, what is that middle? Maybe I don't know yet what that middle is, because in some ways, for me at least, this is a return to particular origins. When I leave here tonight and I go home, I'm also going to a home made out of mud that my great-grandfather built. And so in some ways, you posited this notion that I'm taking the most primitive materials and we're combining them with the most sophisticated technology. And I actually see that in reverse. I see that mankind has been developing the use of mud for 10,000 years. It's actually our most sophisticated material. And the way it works thermally, the way it performs, the way it works environmentally is extremely sophisticated. The robot is a crotchety, weird thing that's always breaking down, that's only existed for 2 years. It's the least sophisticated technology we have for making a building. So I guess the way I look at it is that we're returning to a higher level of construction system by simplifying.
Amen. That was a perfect answer to that question.
Thanks. Well,
I also just want to tell everyone,
transparency. Martin Finio was my materials and methods professor at Columbia University.
but I want to say that you were actually my very, very first class of students. So I couldn't be happier right now.
Now, I'll answer your other question, Martin. We are going to start commercializing these ceramics, and we have a website called loopyceramics.com. So yeah, okay. If you want to take a look, do.
I will be there. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your question. We have another hand up. Luciana, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Well, first I want to congratulate the work from both Rael and Virginia. I think this is great. And I think it's very clear from your work, Ryan, I think from your answer to the previous question that there is an interest in using clay, or how earthy, right, the material is and the connection with the context. But I wonder, we are also talking about 3D printing, right? In LA, we are living this huge housing crisis, and we are looking at 3D printing houses, something that could that be the future of also getting some of those new prototypes done. And I wonder if you guys are thinking, if this research that you've been doing, this work that you've been doing is mostly thinking about clay, or if you see your work also driving some direction in terms of 3D printed housing in a more urban context, right? And if so, would that clay or earth materials would be the answer, or or that could also be the seed of innovation for other ways of thinking material for more urban contexts, ideas of potentially using 3D printing, 3D printed housing as a new possibility.
Luciana, we have printed or at least printed building components for a house in Oakland, California. You might know that the Bay Area has relaxed its building code because of the crisis. And so they're now allowing homeowners to build ancillary units in their backyards up to 1,200 square feet without a design review, which is, you know, a pretty large house. And so we use that as an opportunity to test some of the other materials that we've been experimenting with. Here, of course, we're printing with the mud and the clay because it's contextually the right material. But in the Bay Area, we're also 3D printing with salt from the San Francisco Bay. You know, that's a local material that's been harvested for, I think, over 100 years. And even now, they harvest 150,000 tons of salt every year. And the company that owns the crystallizers in the Bay has actually set aside I think 1,000 acres for a housing development, which does raise that question, like, can you use that material that is literally the ground beneath your feet, the salt, to 3D print with? And so we did some experiments where we 3D printed like salt tiles that we connected together to make a larger structure. We're also printing with sawdust from the Sierras. And so this is, you know, an agricultural waste material. It's essentially free. We have to pay to have the sawdust shipped to us, but we can print with that. And we've printed building components for the facades of buildings. We were printing with Chardonnay grape skins, again, another agricultural waste material. So we're looking at the local contextual materials there and thinking about how we can use them. And I think in the cabin of 3D printed curiosities, which is the very tiny house that we built, we printed all of the pieces and then they became part of the assemblage, as Martin was saying. So we did use a kind of traditional framing system, but then we clad it inside and out. And we did also use clay, but we fired it. So, you know, those clay tiles that clad the building, they'll last 30,000 years. But it is a layered system. And we felt like by making the parts instead of the whole kind of monolithic system, it would allow us to actually introduce 3D printing more quickly than saying, oh, we have to print the whole building, right? We have to make the whole building out of clay or the whole building out of wood or the whole building out of plastic, but rather we can use all of these different materials together that are local and that are from here. So that's, I think, an example of how we're trying to think about it in that urban context with those materials that are local to that particular region.
But I think also I might just offer a little corrective to an assumption that I think exists around the world, which is that buildings made of earth are usually seen as buildings for the poor and in rural environments. But in fact, all around the world on every continent are hundreds of thousands of cities made out of mud. And we often overlook that those cities exist and have existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so really, again, I'm offering this counterposition to thinking about how we advance as a technological society by not employing materials that are damaging to the environment and the ecology, but are in fact maybe corrective to that, to our ecologies, and that we can, I think the big question is, how do we position this material as a contemporary material, one that aligns with our contemporary sensibilities? And that too is a challenge. And I think that is also a design challenge that we have to put before all of us, because I think we all are facing the consequences of a couple hundred years of constructing buildings in very particular ways. Thanks, Luciana, for that question.
So I think we might have time for one more question if I don't see anyone's hand up, but if someone would like to unmute themselves or send a question in the chat. Oh, wait. So we've got one question in the chat from Jisoo Park. I learned recently that we are running out of sand to make concrete and other architectural materials. Do you think that using mud and local materials can substitute this problem?
Well, there is this scarcity of sand globally for its use in concrete. The material mixture that makes adobe does include sand, but it's not necessarily something that needs to be added to the mixture. There are countless ways of constructing a building with mud that are traditional and have existed around the planet, because the admixture has a certain amount of clay, silt, sand, aggregate that can be found naturally. So I think maybe one of the differences is that in the case of concrete, sand is seen as a material that needs to be quarried or mined, so it has a certain homogeneous consistency, as does the aggregate, as does the Portland cement itself, so it can be measured. But mud buildings don't have that same standard, although there are many who are attempting to bring it into certain standards, and it has met the International Building Code, for example. And so there are many techniques in the International Building Codes, COG, round earth, adobe, for example. But I think the difference is that at least at this point, and for the last 10,000 years, it hasn't been an industry that attempts to homogenize and standardize the material, and therefore it's within those practices and capitalistic practices that begin to form these kinds of scarcities. And I think we're kind of liberated from that through this traditional form of craft. At least that's what I think, but I could be wrong.
Which seems like a good place to stop now that we're approaching 8 o'clock and we're talking to Ron in the dark out there. Thank you very much. You certainly can follow up with questions. If anyone has any, you can contact the League directly. We are recording this, so it will be up on our website within a few weeks. Next month, we're going to the current border. We're going to El Paso and seeing the studios and visiting the border with Ursula Kripa and Stephen Wilber, who I know that Ron has worked with actually on some projects on the border too. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you in a month. The League has a number of programs coming up in December, so please visit our website and take a look at our current work programs and our urban omnibus essays, and please consider joining the League if you're not a member now. Thanks for joining us tonight.